Welcome to this screencast on Chapter 19, Transforming the West. This is a PowerPoint from a fellow AP teacher named Susan Imposier from Chappaqua, New York at Horace Greeley High School. Now, the conflict that begins in the West starts with the railroads. You have the railroad builders, and as you can see on this map here, railroads expanded tremendously during the 1860s to 1900. You can see here that we have the creation of the Transcontinental Railroad, and that starts around Omaha, Nebraska, around in here somewhere, by the Union Pacific. Notice as it's traveling west, working with the Central Pacific that is traveling east, and they're going to meet somewhere at Promontory Point, Utah, somewhere up in here. And it is going to be this transcontinental railroad that brings all these settlers out west. It's also able to bring the resources and the things that they need to make viable settlements out west. Now, it's not only the railroads that bring all these settlers. You know that gold and silver and all these other things were discovered as well that brought miners as well as settlers into the region. Now, the Plains Indians are made up of a variety of different groups. We're going to talk mostly about the Sioux. We have two branches of the Sioux Indian, the Lakota Sioux and the Dakota Sioux. We're going to talk about the Cheyenne, the Arapahoe. We're going to talk about the Hopi, and we're going to talk about the Zuni. And all of these different groups made up what were known as the Plains Indians. And for the most part, they were nomadic peoples that followed the herds of the buffalo. Now, some of the conflicts that arose is noted here on this map by the little burst on the map. You have the Treaty of Fort Laramie, and you also have the Colorado Gold Rush, and that's going to cause a lot of this conflict. The Treaty of Fort Laramie basically is the idea that we are going to move Native Americans from their traditional hunting grounds to reservations, and this is not a new policy. If you'll recall, the Indian Removal Act of 1830 during Andrew Jackson's administration removed Native Americans from the southeast, out of Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Tennessee, to reservations in Oklahoma. So this is not a new policy, and so it's going to be met with conflict here in the West as we are asking different groups again to get out of the white settlers' way. And this idea of white settlers having control of this land arises not only of this idea of superiority over Native Americans, but also out of the belief of manifest destiny, which basically states that it is our God-given destiny that we are going to control the territory from the East Coast to the West Coast under the great nation of the United States. Now, there are several conflicts that happen as a result, so I'm going to go through some of those. You have one of the early ones that I don't think is mentioned in your textbook that revolved around the Dakota Sioux. And this is a group that had agreed to live on a small reservation in Minnesota in exchange for annuities or government payments. And unfortunately, what happened there is, living on the reservation, traders took advantage of them. And oftentimes, traders would convince the Indian Peace Commissioners, the Indian agents who were in charge of taking care of the Native Americans, they would convince them that they owed them, that the Native Americans owed the traders money, and so oftentimes never got their money. Adding to the problem was that the government delayed the payments, and so as a result, the Dakota Sioux were starving, and they asked to get food on credit, and I can't remember the guy's name, but one of them basically very coldly said, well, just let them eat grass. This, of course, is going to lead to a rebellion by the Dakota Sioux. They were led by Chief Little Crow. They fled the reservation. They found Myrick. I don't remember his first name. His last name is Myrick, with grass stuffed in his mouth. But basically, the Dakota Sioux had had enough. And so they fled the reservation. Over 307 of them, by the time the conflict came to an end, were convicted by the military tribunal, but President Abraham Lincoln had reduced that number to 37 that were actually convicted of their crimes, but many of them became exiles in their own land. Another incident that happened was the Lakota Sioux, and they fought to maintain control of their hunting grounds in the Black Hills of South Dakota. What's going on in South Dakota is that gold is going to be discovered there. Now, this is a group that's going to be led by Chief Red Cloud, Crazy Horse, and Sitting Bull. And basically, these are groups that had gained control of their hunting grounds from other groups, and they were not going to allow the settlers to take it away from them. And in the end, it winds up being what is known as Fetterman's Massacre. Crazy Horse allures the troops into a trap, and they are ambushed by the Lakota warriors, and they basically wipe out Fetterman's men. And this happened along the Bozeman Trail. So that happened on December 21st, 1866, killing over 80 soldiers. Another incident took place at Sand Creek, and Sand Creek is where you had both the Cheyenne and the Arapahoe. Together, they attacked miners and settlers who were coming into their territory in search of gold. Again, notice that gold and the discovery of it is causing a lot of conflict. And some would even say that it's the greed of these miners violating the treaties that the Native Americans enter into with the Americans that causes a lot of these conflicts. Chief Black Kettle brought several hundred Cheyenne to negotiate peace after a time period of violence where they are attacking the settlers that come onto the reservation. And so, under the guise of truce or negotiation, Chief Black Kettle is told to camp in this one place, waiting on someone to come negotiate with him. But it is going to be one of the American troops, Chivington, that says, kill and scalp all, big and little, and it results in the Sandy Creek Massacre on November 29th, 1864. And it killed over, I believe it was over 200 Cheyenne and Arapahoe men, women, and children. Now, the reservation policy, as I mentioned, again, you have this effort to make peace. You have the Indian Peace Commission comes out of Medicine Lodge Creek, and the solution there was to make two major reservations, one for the Sioux, one for other Plains Native Americans. And basically, this is a policy that's doomed for failure. Native Americans don't want to live on the reservations. They just want to be free to hunt the buffalo and to do their traditional cultures, but Americans want the lands. And so this happened, you have what's the Indian Peace Commission of 1867, also known as the Treaty of Medicine Lodge Creek, which establishes, again, the reservation policy. Like I mentioned, gold is found in the Black Hills of the Dakota Territory in 1874, which leads to the Battle of Little Bighorn. Settlers venture onto the Lakota Sioux territory in the Black Hills, and the Lakota Sioux leave the reservation. They say, look, you're not abiding by your terms of the treaty, so we're no longer going to abide by the terms of the treaty as well. And so they begin to leave the reservation to hunt on traditional hunting grounds. Government sends Lieutenant Colonel George Custer to launch an attack or to an expedition to control the violence that's going on, and he's a very impulsive officer, and he launches an attack on a much larger group of Lakota and Cheyenne warriors. As a result, Custer and all of his men are going to be wiped out. And it also is going to represent this renewed violence against Native Americans. You also have Chief Joseph, who led the Nez Perce. They also left the reservation, and they go on over a 300-mile trek across the west in an effort to try to avoid having to go to the reservation, but in the end, trapped by a very bitter winter, Chief Joseph makes the very famous statement that I will fight no more forever after he watched his people freeze to death and starve to death in the winter of 1877. Other famous leaders from the Plains Native Americans is Geronimo. The American government sent many troops in search of Geronimo as he moved all across the West. And there were also those who did not support the federal government's policy towards Native Americans. But before we get to that, I also wanted to mention Wounded Knee, the Battle of Wounded Knee. Sitting Bull, famous for, of course, the Battle of Little Bighorn, had returned from Canada. He had fled there after that battle. The Lakota Sioux began performing a ritual called the Ghost Dance, where basically it was a ritual where they hoped to bring about the disappearance of the settlers, the return of the buffalo, and they could be reunited with their ancestors. And, of course, the Army didn't want them performing this ritual because, of course, it led to conflict between them and the United States government and the troops. Army tries to arrest Sitting Bull because they blame him for it. Sitting Bull's supporters open fire. In the exchange of gunfire, Sitting Bull is killed. The remainders that have been performing the ghost dance flee. They are chased down. Eventually, December 29th, 1890, there's an agreement reached where troops are disarming Native Americans. Unfortunately, a gun goes off, and gunfire erupts, and it resulted in the deaths of over 200 Lakota men, women, and children, and 25 American soldiers. Now, as I mentioned before, there were those that saw what was happening to the Native Americans and tried to bring people's attention to it. Helen Hunt Jackson wrote A Century of Dishonor, in which she documented all of the brutality towards Native Americans and the inherent discriminatory policies towards Native Americans. And so this is ultimately what led to the Peace Commission that I mentioned earlier. But it wasn't really a solution. It was just another case of where the American government imposed upon the Native Americans a way of life that was not necessarily fit within their culture. After the failure of the reservation policy, you have what is considered to be the Dawes Severalty Act, which basically initiated the assimilation policy. And this is where they wanted Native Americans to become more like white settlers, to take on farming, as you can see from this picture, to take on the ways of the white man. They oftentimes would remove children from their Native American parents, put them in these schools like at Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania, and teach them these ways. Unfortunately, what would happen is that you had this whole generation of Native American children who were not accepted in white society, but also not accepted in Native American society because their Native American heritage had been erased. And so really it's an unfortunate circumstance where the Native Americans were just treated unfairly throughout history, and there was no real solution for what happened. Here's some examples of the Arapahoe ghost dance that I mentioned earlier, and a rather graphic picture, I apologize for that, of Chief Bigfoot's lifeless body after the Wounded Knee battle in 1890. Now, I mentioned Promontory Point, Utah, where you have the unification of the Transcontinental Railroad with the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific. And, of course, you have mining. They're in search of gold, silver, copper, lead, all these resources needed to fuel the rising industry in the east. And as you can see from this map, we have a lot of the different economic activity. So take a moment and look at that, and look at the areas of copper, of silver and gold mining, and all the different areas that are found throughout the west. You have, as a result of all this mining, what are called boom or bust towns. When gold was discovered in an area, very quickly, these towns would spring up overnight. There'd be no government, there'd be no law, and basically anything would go in these towns. You had prostitution, you had gunfights all the time, but just as quickly as these towns sprung up, they would disappear, hence the term ghost towns or bust towns. So also out west you had the cattlemen, what we call ranchers, and of course they are the ones that raised the cattle and would do the long drive and ship them to the railheads to be shipped east to be either butchered or to have them butchered on site and sent to the east. And here's a map of all the different trails where you would have these cowhands or these cowboys basically herd all of these cattle from the open range to these railheads. The open range were large areas of grasslands owned by the government where people basically could raise their cattle for free. And it became lucrative because of the soaring prices following the Civil War, and also because of the cheap overhead provided by the open range or the grasslands provided by the government. And they've also found a type of cattle that could withstand the harsh winters of the Great Plains as well, the Texas Longhorn. This gives you an example of the land use of the 1880s. Notice how extensive cattle is out west. You're also going to have extensive growth of wheat and some other crops out in the west. And what's going to bring about that is new agricultural technology. It's the prairie fan that allows for them to dig wells so they can access water, because it's called the plains because they don't get enough rainfall. The abundance of their rainfall comes in the form of snow during the winter. The steel plow is able to bust through or break through the very thick roots of the grass that grows on the plains. And these people who made these houses in the plains were called sod busters. The barbed wire is going to help bring about an end to the long drive and these in the open range, because farmers are going to start fencing off their land to keep the cattle out of their lands, and that's going to be invented by Joseph Glidden. It's going to become very popular. It's a very cheap way to fence off land because there's not much wood in the plains because there are no trees. There's a picture of the Texas Longhorn, and of course the Cowboys. We've all heard about the different cowboys, and much of it is myth. You have this idea of the Bronc Buster by Frederick Remington, but the reality of the situation was that many of the cowboys of the West were former slaves, escaped slaves, freedmen that had left the South in search of a better way of life. And so we have the myth, and then of course we have the reality. And it is going to be the Colt 45 that really kind of equalizes things in the West. And Samuel Colt was very famous for the statement, "God didn't make men equal, Colonel Colt did," because it's the quick-loading gun that makes them all very equal out there. You have some of these legendary gunslingers and train robbers from this time period that helped romanticize this time period. Jesse James, Billy the Kid. You have the Dodge City Peace Commission that's been the subject of many different westerns. But in reality, as I mentioned, you had all these different groups that came out that do not fit within that myth. You have the Exodusters, and this was another group of African Americans who left the South to try their hand in the Great Plains. The government encouraged settlement out west. You have this graphic that shows the different minorities that moved out west after 1850, from 1850 to 1890. You have the Buffalo Soldiers, and notice that the Buffalo Soldiers are made up of African Americans and different groups, and they're going to play an instrumental role in the Spanish-American War that we're going to talk about in later chapters. And from there we're moving on to the farmers.